book 2 of the exact exposition of the Orthodox faith. And like the other day, as I was going over this week, and I was thinking, I don't know how long we're going to be here, because so much of this chapter, while it can be discussed at great length, how much of it really, well, let me start with this question. How much of this really has to do with the Orthodox faith, the Christian faith, any faith per se?
I really wanted to ask you about that, because I mean it's interesting, but it's really I'm not exactly sure why it's there.
Okay.
Or why it's included.
Why do you think it's there? Hold on.
I mean, I guess it just puts parameters on, the sciences of the time. It establishes an orientation towards, I guess, the science.
Well, I mean, what's book 2 about? Creation.
Yeah.
So he talks about essentially everything that was known. So air, water, fire, earth, the 4 elements.
Incidentally, 2 semesters ago, I wrote a paper on alchemy. Like, it was a concept exploration of alchemy. So I did a bunch of research into the 4 elements and everything like that. So I just ate all that up. I was having
because
I'm not saying I have any kind of beef with St. John for writing, but it did seem kind of incongruent. I didn't mind it, but yeah, it's kind of...
like what we were discussing before, like, ultimately what all this is that, during the time period, we don't do this so much nowadays, but during the time period this was written in, people tied, spiritual reality to physical reality.
Oh, sure.
More. Every aspect of creation was seen as basically a metaphor for something spiritual. So, and this, what we're looking at here is in a lot of ways like the origin or the motivation of science, which at least in its origins was to, by exploring the universe, exploring physical reality, you're learning more about the God who created it.
Well, Einstein said, he studied physics and everything because he wanted to understand the mind of God.
Yeah.
Sir Isaac Newton essentially did the exact same thing. They arrived at different destinations because Einstein was an atheist and Newton wasn't. Let's go back to the first one, chapter 1 of book 2, and he talks about the ages and how you understand age, in different ways according to different contexts. And he even goes to, on page 204, talking about the 7 ages. Well, that's a literary idea. That's not a theological, necessarily, idea. You don't have a biblical passage that talks about the 7 ages of man, though you do have biblical passages that are taken as metaphors for the ages of man, etc. But one of the things that he says, he talks about the 7 ages and then says the 8th age is the age which is to come. And that's kind of this Jewish idea that also, for example, Sunday is the Lord's Day, but it's in early Christian literature, it's also called the 8th day. That is, it's the day after the 7th day. The Sabbath is the 7th day. So even though it's the first day of the week, it's also called the 8th day, okay? Which means it's the fulfillment. It's everything is done. Everything is over and such, okay? Chapter 2, very short. Don't really need to say anything. What about chapter 3? Is there anything in there you found?
This was the one that really stuck out to me the most, I think.
Chapter 3, yeah. About the angels?
I say this mainly because, growing up, I was fascinated by the concept of angels and everything. I read a bunch of books, like by Frank Peretti and stuff. That discuss
Warrior angels and all that, yeah.
It's a fun concept for a kid, this idea that there's these battles, happening, just outside of where we can see, and everything's bad. And it's a powerful idea. I thought it was interesting though. So let's see, where he says, where he talks about how angels are really nothing more than intellects. They don't have any, physical, bodies. But on page 208, right about in the middle, the first large paragraph on page 208, he talks about the six-winged seraphim and the many-eyed cherubim, and he doesn't really expound on that. But I immediately, what does that mean? Because you just said that they don't have bodies,
Incorporeal,
and so presumably that's some sort of metaphorical.
It is.
But metaphors of what? Like, what does it mean? Like,
well, in Ezekiel, described as six-winged. Okay? You have the cherubim described by, the seraphim. You have the cherubim described when God told Moses to build the tabernacle, and how the tabernacle was to be decorated with these tapestries and such. And you're going to have the altar with the mercy seat, and the mercy seat, seraphim sitting on it, etc. Now, the many-eyed cherubim, that's one I am familiar with, where some writers talk about the many-eyed as, this all-seeing. Right. They're ever present and ever aware. The word seraphim means perpetual motion. So the six-winged implies they're constantly moving. But the cherubim and the seraphim are constantly moving, as it were, before the throne of God. They never move away from that.
Okay. So this is really the kind of angels that would go out and do things. Okay.
No, and bear in mind, angel just comes from the Latin angelus, messenger.
Right.
Postman, if you want. No. Back up for a minute, because he talks about the angelic nature and about how it's incorporeal, but then says, but of course, it's not really incorporeal, because the only incorporeal thing is God.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, because he says they're circumscribed because if he basically said there's distinctions.
Exactly.
Because if there aren't distinctions, then that would mean that they were,
they would be uncircumscribed.
A single being with many different minds, which of course would be God.
So on the bottom of 205, an angel is an intellectual substance, ever in motion, free and corporeal, ministering to God with the gift of immortality in his nature. Now, compared with us, we say the angel is incorporeal and immaterial. But in comparison with God, who alone is incomparable, everything proves to be gross and material. So in comparison to us, an angel is incorporeal. In comparison to God, an angel's like this table. Okay? Because God is the only one like that. And then later on, he talks about the angelic nature being rational, intelligent, and free, while insofar as it is created, it's changeable and has the power to persevere in progress and good, or turn. And then later on in the chapter 4, he talks about what happens, if they choose to follow evil or to do evil. With humanity, there's always an option or possibility for repentance up until death. Right. For angels,
they're basically
once they choose, it's
because they don't have the reason we're allowed the choice is because we live on Earth, we have bodies and everything like that. Once that ends, once we are essentially like the angels,
spirit,
choice ends.
Exactly.
And so it would follow, of course, that any choices that the angels make are also final.
One of the things I like about St. John of Damascus is when he, for example, says, top of 207, whether the angels are equal in essence or whether they differ from one another, we do not know. And he seems to be pretty upfront about admitting when there's no knowledge of something. Okay, but then goes on later on and talks that passage that Gregory mentioned on page 208 of the differing orders. Now, bear in mind, he doesn't say anything new
Right.
throughout the entire book. He's merely compiling, but he compiles and arranges and orders and clarifies much of what had been said previous. Now, what he's doing here with these 9 orders, or these 3 orders, and then within each order there are 3, is he's getting all of that. The writer named Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. It's not really Dionysius the Areopagite that spoke with, but is another Dionysius. He's usually referred to as, your footnote has it, as pseudo Dionysius. So you have the first order of the angelic beings, cherubim and thrones. The second order, the dominations, the virtues, and the powers. And the third, principalities, archangels, and angels. And those are based upon the writings of Paul. We're not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers, etc., etc. Okay? Chapter 4, where he goes on and talks about, essentially, the origin of evil. And it's a fairly short chapter. You would expect it to, longer than that. But he doesn't. Talking about Satan, he did not keep the brightness and dignity which the Creator had bestowed upon him. This is page 2. By his free choice, he turned from what was according to nature to what was against it. What was according to nature was to follow God. Okay? So he turns against that. So he is the first to abandon good and become evil. Why? Because good is merely the privation. Evil is the privation of good. It's the absence of good. Good is spiritual light, evil is spiritual darkness, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And then he talks about the rest of the horde of angels that follow him. Okay? And he goes on, the bottom, to talk about whether or not evil spirits foretell the future, or take that back, know the future. He says they don't know the future, nevertheless, they foretell it. The angels do so when God reveals the future to them and orders them to foretell it, for whatever reason God says. But the evil spirits foretell the future, sometimes by seeing the things that are happening far ahead, sometimes by guessing at them. So if they're guessing at them, they could be wrong. All right? For this reason, one must not believe them. And keep in mind, it seems like he says this somewhere in here, one should never believe the demons anyways, even when they're telling the truth. Even, in the Gospels, when Christ confronts, somebody who's possessed and a demon yells out, what have we to do with you, Christ, the Son of God? He makes them shut up. He doesn't say, yeah, go ahead, keep telling everybody who I am. Like it's proof it's there. Why? Because they're to be listened to. They're not to be believed at all. So, one should note that the fall is to the angels just what death is to men. Once they fell, no return. Okay? Chapter 5, there's really nothing. Chapter 6 is this. Chapter 6 to me is where it kind of starts to get kind of odd. Where he starts talking about the word and what that connotes, and talks about the outer shell, so that the world is described, like earth, and there's the heavens outside, and then there's another heavens as well. There's the air, etc.
Firmament.
There's the firmament, and the firmament above, and the firmament below. But what he does is he starts to use the language that we're going to see later, later in the Middle Ages, of the spheres, okay, the planets, etc. So, I'm going to skip some of that. Talks about the water above the earth and below the earth. And then chapter 7, well, let me take that back. Go back to chapter 6 for a moment. It's on page 212 where he talks about years. Here it's only 7, whereas in the Middle Ages it's 9 concentric spheres. Okay? Talks about the planets, the sun, the moon, Jupiter, etc. But then he says, on page 213 at the bottom. All things which have a beginning are subject to corruption as a logical consequence of their nature, and the heavens are no exception. What does he mean as a logical consequence of their nature? Why are they subject to corruption? Well, what's corruption?
Just decay.
Decay. Okay. So what's another word for decay? Think of one of the words in Obama's campaign slogan in 2008. It's not hope. Change. Okay? It's change. That's all decay is. Okay? So, what created suffer change. Its very coming into being was change. It changed from having no existence to having existence. That's why he says it follows of a logical nature. Its nature is very okay. So he says everything that has a beginning, the heavens, the earth, animals, plants, whatever, angelic beings. Okay.
Yeah, that was one thing that I thought was interesting. That he says that angels are not naturally immortal, but only remain immortal by a specific sort of
By grace.
grace
Yeah.
of God. That angels, like, that naturally they would decay, like our bodies would decay, which I thought was sort of interesting. You know, I guess in a sense though, you kind of the idea, it sort of all ties back to the idea that the universe only exists because God actively wills it to. That if God at any point decided to, you know, that if God's mind at any point sort of turned away from the universe, it wouldn't be there anymore.
Exactly.
You know?
Snuff out in an instant. Okay. Chapter 7, he goes on to talk about fire and light, because light is an element of fire. And then he talks about the 7 spheres on 216 and where they're located, okay, in relation to the earth and such. And then he goes on into the seasons. Has nothing to do with faith per se, other than, as Gregory mentioned earlier, every physical aspect of the world has or is a reflection of a deeper underlying spiritual meaning. Okay? But what he doesn't do in here is he doesn't address the deeper underlying spiritual meaning. Though he does talk about the wet and the cold, the dry, the hot, okay, the elements and the humors, and those have aspects. Okay?
Is he laying out a zodiac here?
Yeah, he even goes into the zodiac.
I missed that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in 217, I mean, if you go on and study medieval literature, or, you know, even every minute's humor, since I'll use Johnson and not Shakespeare, since you guys are tired of Shakespeare,
I'm not tired of Shakespeare. I'm tired of Twilight.
talks about, don't even go there, talks about, you know, black bile and yellow bile, etc. Those are all parts of the humor. And then he goes 218 to the zodiac. Okay, why? Because he's going to argue that there is some astrological significance to where the planets and stars are when one is born? No, he doesn't do that at all. He just says, these are the names of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Okay? Now, what's he talking about? They say. Okay, this is kind of the pagan philosophers. All right? So what's he doing? He's dealing with attempting to deal with all human kind of knowledge of the world. All right? But then he says at the bottom, after talking about the zodiac, bottom of 218, now the Greeks say that all our affairs are governed by the rising, setting, and conjunction of these stars and of the sun and moon, astrology, and / alchemy. With such things is astrology concerned. He says, but we don't. Why? Because the planets and such give absolutely no indication of our actions. We have been made free by the Creator. We control our own actions. We determine our destiny. In other words, if you're familiar with Shakespeare and you're familiar with King Lear, he would be entirely in agreement with in King Lear, who says, people aren't the way they are because they were born under a disposition of a moon or and a planet. No, people are the way they are because that's how they want to be. All right? If everything we do by the movement of the stars, then whatever we do by necessity. So, if, I know Robert's into psychology, if behaviorism is correct, then I can't
You're
be
off the
held.
hook.
That's
Yeah.
right, I'm off the hook. If behaviorism is correct, then, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is not responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing.
Oh, if he's responsible. I mean, when you call martial law, you better produce somebody. But that's a whole other.
That's another, I don't want to go there.
But yeah, everybody.
But if behaviorism and determinism are correct, what you wore this morning was determined eons ago.
It's funny that you talk about like everybody's off the hook, but I think in a far more terrifying application of that, nobody's worthy of any praise.
Sure.
I mean, Mother Teresa what she did wasn't this selfless act that's worthy of praise. It was just what she was going to do, what she was always going to do. She doesn't. It's not a matter of free choice. It's just
We're all automatons.
Yeah.
We're just robots.
Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter what you do. So, if that's the case, then Nietzsche's right. Nietzsche's right and Hitler's right. With essentially, if there is no reward, there is no punishment, if there is no responsibility, if there is no praise, then you only go around once, go for the gusto. Grab what you can. Okay? Sartre and Camus are right in essentially saying it doesn't make a difference whether you help the little old lady across the road or you push her in front of the oncoming Mack truck. Either way, according to their branch of existentialism, the world know that you exist. You authenticated your existence, to use their language. So that's why he goes on and says, by necessity is neither virtue nor vice. And if we have neither virtue nor vice, we deserve neither reward nor punishment. Hence, if the Greeks are right, God will prove to be unjust when he gives good things to some and tribulations to others. In other words, God would be unjust by hardening Pharaoh's heart. And just by taking Lazarus into heaven and punishing the rich man. All right? But if all driven and moved by necessity, you got to keep going back, then God will not be exercising either control over his creatures or providence for them. In other words, if everything is driven by necessity, then even God is driven by necessity, in which case he's not God, in which case necessity becomes God, or whatever you want to call it. So, reason will also be useless to us. Why? Because you won't actually be reasoning. All right?
It's funny that's just like the analogy that Alvin Plantinga gives. That is, if I think I've mentioned this before.
He's a 20th century Christian philosopher. 21st century is also.
But
still
his thing is that if evolution influences behavior, but it doesn't have to influence reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way he puts it, like if you're out in the jungle and you see a roaring lion or a tiger, what evolution needs to do is to get you to run and hide or climb a tree to get away from the tiger, right? Can do that by telling you that the tiger is your best friend, so long as your reaction to thinking the tiger is to run and hide in a tree. There's no actual correlation between thought and action, except that
You run and hide, yeah.
So reasoning is not necessary for survival. Not truth gathering.
Yeah, it's outside.
Yeah.
Okay, then chapter 8 is about air.
You know what this is? This is the plot of Avatar: The Last Airbender.
It serves 3 of our senses, etc. Chapter 9 is then about, you know, I don't really have a lot to say.
I'm a fan of it.
Yeah, kind of like it, get thirsty without it, you know.
Yeah.
Can't live without it. Chapter 10 is about Earth. Okay. One of the interesting things about chapter 10 is on page 228, when he's talking about, you know, what Earth produces, etc., and he says everything was made for the use of man. Animals, some were made for meat or food, etc., etc. But then towards the bottom of the page, he says, there is no animal or plant in which the Creator has not put some virtue that is of use for the needs of man. You know? And what do we, you know, what do our drug companies do so much R&D for? You know, they go off into the wilds of Borneo or South America, whatever, and they find plants, and lo and behold, what do they find out? They find plants that native peoples have known about for hundreds or thousands of years, and they've been taking them and chewing them, and they never get cancer, or they never get something that solves, you know. So the drug company takes it makes an extract, whatever, and starts churning out pills. What he's saying is, like evil thought, like you see, you know, in Shakespeare, King Lear, for example, plants have virtue or power. And you see Tolkien do the same thing, for example, in The Lord of the Rings. You know, Aragorn uses a plant to bring people back from their blackness when they get injured, etc.
I mean, it's almost like we're a part of the world we live in. I don't know why that's so
Why that's so
hard
foreign?
to understand, especially with modern pharmacology, where it's
Well,
like,
the reason it's
like penicillin. I made that the other week.
the reason it's so hard to understand is because since the Enlightenment,
It's improvement.
well, not only that, but how has humanity viewed itself in relation to the world around it?
As something
Separate.
As separate. And so we talk about, you know, the war on nature, the war with nature, or Mother Nature is angry with us, not realizing by the language we use, not necessarily up here, not realizing by the language we use, we are part of nature. We're as much part of nature as those trees outside that window. What we like to do is we like to think that we control nature. And so we create things like the Army Corps of Engineers, which thinks it can direct them. It's called big water for one reason. When spring comes, get the hell out of the way. That's why. Okay? You cannot build, you know, in flood zones. It's like, you know, building 20-story tall hotels on the tip of Florida. You know, there's a reason there's an opening between Florida and Cuba. It's so that the storms can come right through that area. All right? Or, you know, great big hotels and everything on the San Andreas Fault. Big old crack in the earth should tell you not a good place to build. Yeah. But because of arrogance, there's a wonderful book I used to use in a comp class called The Arrogance of Humanism, about, you know, man's love of himself and such. You know, that essentially talks about why we think we can control everything. And when the world doesn't work according to the way we want, as if the world slaps us and to say, you're not as powerful as you think you are. Okay.
I remember back when in Hurricane Katrina, like when the hurricanes came through and just destroyed all of that. And I remember thinking, and they started rebuilding. And I remember thinking, why does anybody want to go? Why does anybody want to still live there? Why would anybody want to do that?
I've not been back to New Orleans since then. I used to live in southern Mississippi, and we'd go down to New Orleans once every couple months or so. But from what I understand, the majority of the people that left New Orleans are back. So, for example, the Ninth Ward is pretty much empty.
And there's a lot of the city that's never been
That's a
fixed.
sensible thing to do. I mean,
Well, you keep in mind, you know, New Orleans is about 20 sea level.
Yeah.
To get into New Orleans from Mississippi, you have to drive over Lake Pontchartrain. New Orleans, like here, Pontchartrain's up here. So it doesn't take much for a sea surge to come in and whoosh, just turn it, because New Orleans is literally in a bowl.
Yeah.
And so you have Lake Pontchartrain, you've got the Mississippi, and you've got the Gulf. Not a good mix, okay? But
We built there, and we continue to do so.
and we think it's a good idea,
bizarre.
and we subsidize loans and
I know.
insurance.
And so many tax dollars and charity money went to this place to rebuild homes there, and they're just gonna get knocked over again.
Well, but the same thing applies,
Well,
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
everything's gonna get knocked over someday.
but the same thing applies to many places, not just New Orleans.
Yeah.
Pretty much anywhere along the coast, whether you're talking the East Coast or the West Coast. The West Coast you don't have to worry about. The West Coast you have to worry about earthquakes. And the Cascadia subduction zone along the Northwest coast. When that sucker rips again, it ripped was about 500 years ago, there won't be a Portland. There won't be a Vancouver. There won't be a Seattle. They'll be gone, okay? We'll move so much. I mean, the earthquake in Japan a couple of years ago, that'll be a baby compared to when this one goes again, all right? So, chapter 11. He talks about Eden and what it was like. And so he says on page 230, just about the last sentence, second to last sentence, it was a divine place and a worthy habitation for God in his image. And what's he talking about Eden? He's talking about Eden as a place fit for humanity's physical senses as well as humanity's spiritual, nature. That's why he says, for God who created us did not want us to be careful and troubled about many things, nor to be anxious and concerned for our own life. That's what happened to Adam. Okay? He didn't want us to be anxious and troubled about many things. What does he mean? Adam was to live day by day. Wasn't to be thinking about tomorrow at all. Wasn't thinking about life insurance. Wasn't thinking about storing up food. Anything like that. Okay? In other words, was to be living day by day, trusting solely in the providence of God. Okay? God wanted us to be dispassionate like that. For that is passionlessness to the highest degree. What does he mean? Not caring at all about 10 minutes from now, 20 minutes from now, 10 days from now, but living, essential philosophers really said, totally in the moment. Totally for now. Okay? He wanted us to be free from care, to have but one task, which was the same task of the angels, to praise God. Period. But instead, Adam said, ooh, look, there's a tree. All right? We can skip some more of that. Let's see here. Chapter 12, he talks about how humanity was made, how God formed his body from the ground and stuff, and how he's made innocent and straightforward. It's page 235. Virtuous, free from pain, free from care, ornamented with every virtue. Notice he made, past tense, man, innocent, straightforward, virtuous. And compare that with now. But also innocent. Usually not straightforward, but somewhat, oftentimes at least, duplicitous. Virtuous, free from pain, not free from care, ditto. Ornamented with every virtue, not really. Adorned with all good qualities, maybe some. Him a living being to be life and then to be removed elsewhere to the world to come. And therefore to complete the mystery by becoming divine through reversion to God. All right? He had the power to persevere, but he gave it up. How? Because he had free will. Period. That's it. And he's going to go on, he's going to go on in a later chapter and talk about free will quite a bit. But the remainder of this chapter, he goes to talk about what the body is made up of, or what all bodies are made up of in terms of the four elements. I don't want to talk really about the rational and irrational parts of the soul unless somebody else does. Chapter 13 is about pleasures of the soul and of the body. Chapter 14, 4 different kinds of pain. Doesn't really matter. It's all just pain. 15, different kinds of fear. Now, think about these, 2 chapters. Well, even the 14, 15, and 16 about pain, fear, and anger. Why, or is it even necessary to distinguish between the different kinds of each of these? Fear, apprehension, diffidence, shame, terror, consternation, and anxiety. Why is it necessary to go through and distinguish between each of those? It's the kind of thing Aristotle did. Aristotle always completely defined and delineated everything. And that's probably why he's doing this. Okay? Because he's drawing conclusions that then make it easier, or let me rephrase that. To what he wants to get to later in terms of repairing humanity, repairing the human soul, then you can deal with love and mercy, etc., that deal with apprehension and diffidence and shame, etc. Okay? And 17 and 18, I don't have really much I want to say. And the long chapter about passion on 22, I don't either. If you guys have portions in these chapters you want to talk about, stop me. 25, free will. Okay? How does he define free will? What depends upon us? That is, what actions that flow from us, or that the word depend literally hang upon us. The first consideration as to whether there is anything that does depend upon us, because there are a number of people who deny it. That is, philosophers who say we don't have any free will because nothing we do is free. A second consideration is as to what things depend upon us over what things we do have control. And the third is to explain the reason for which God made us free. Okay? So, the first question, he says, there are those who say that things that happen is either caused by God or necessity or fate or nature or chance or spontaneity. In other words, we have no say in the matter. Think of Oedipus. Okay? What happened in Oedipus?
All of his efforts failed.
All of his efforts failed. Why?
Because the gods decreed that a particular...
Well, it wasn't that the gods decreed. The gods announced.
Right.
But it was fate that decreed.
Right.
So the fates are standing back here behind the gods. All right? So what did Oedipus do? He attempted to run an end run around fate. Okay? Was he free to do that? Or was that all fate?
It's all part of it, because he runs right into it.
He runs right into it. He thought he was free. Okay? And I think Sophocles thinks he's free, but it's that he's not realizing that his freedom is working in conjunction with fate to complete fate. So, he says, down towards the bottom of 256, if man is not an effective principle of action, that is, if he's not free to act, to which of these causes are we to attribute human actions? It's definitely wrong ever to ascribe immoral and unjust actions to God. He's saying because of the definition of God, he can't be immoral or unjust. Neither can they be ascribed to necessity. for they're not the actions of things which are always the same. That is, necessity should never change. It should always produce the same result, essentially. Nor can they be ascribed to fate, for they declare that the things decreed by fate are not contingent but necessary. Nor to nature, for the works of nature are animals and plants. Nor to chance, for human actions are not unusual and unexpected. Well, some actions aren't. Nor yet to spontaneity, for the reasons he gives. Therefore, nothing remains but the fact that man himself, as acting and doing, is the principle of his own works and is free. Okay? So, if that's true, then the results of those actions are the things that depend upon man. The dropping of an atomic bomb, okay, is a free action. Shooting somebody is a free action. Nobody forces one to do that. Okay? Flipping somebody off who cut you off on the highway is a free action. Just because they cut you off did not necessitate that finger. I know, Jason, it's hard. Sometimes it's, So, chapter 26. Some things done depend upon us while others do not. Those things depend upon us which we are free either to do or not to do. That is, everything we do voluntarily. Well, what do we not do voluntarily? Breathe. Or you can stop if you want.
Yeah, but
But you're going to start again unless you jump in an ocean. Okay? So, for a thing would not be said to be done voluntarily if the action did not depend upon us. All right? We understand that. So, things done freely are the things that can incur blame or praise. We can help the old lady across the street, or we can push in front of the car. So, therefore, he goes on and says in chapter 27, the freedom of the will is directly connected with the reason. It's reason that determines what the will does, how it acts, how it behaves. All right? And he goes on in this chapter, in the next chapter, to talk about reason and how reason is applied to the will and those things that happen as a result. And then in 29, he goes on to talk about God and God's providence. All right? So he says, providence then is the solicitude which God has for existing things. What does he mean by solicitude? Care, concern, love. Providence is God's care for existing things. So providence is that will of God by which all existing things receive suitable guidance through to their end. It's the providence of God that keeps, the lion having enough food. It's the providence of God that makes the rain to fall, etc., that makes the sun to rise. Okay, so what he's saying here is it's the providence of God that, to use the language that Gregory used earlier, that keeps everything going. It's active. It's not passive. Okay? It's an ongoing concern. But if providence is God's will, then according to right reason, everything that has come about through providence has quite necessarily come about. How? In the best manner and that most befitting God, so that could not have happened in a better way. In other words, what he's saying is, this is the best of all possible worlds. Because when people try to imagine a better world, what does it always imply? Less choice, less freedom. Think of every utopia that has ever been imagined. And the people are less free in those utopias. Okay? So he goes on, talks about God providing and carrying, etc. Bearing these things in mind, we should admire, praise, and unconditionally accept all the works of providence. Well, what does he mean by that? He means not only the rain falling when the rain ought to fall, and the snow falling when it ought to fall, but he means even the aspect of providence that permits things to happen, like bombing the Boston Marathon. Okay? These should appear to a number of people to be unjust. Should these appear to a number of people to be unjust, it's because of the fact that God's providence is beyond knowledge and beyond comprehension. And because to him alone are our thoughts and actions and the events of the future. In other words, he is saying, because God's perspective, as I've done before, is like this, and this is time, and God sees time all now. It's that foreknowledge, that knowing everything that's going to happen, okay, that allows everything to work. The only problem is what's going to happen in the next second. We like to think we do. We like to act like we do. We like to act and think like we know what's going to happen the next hour, the next day, the next week, and nobody does. Okay? So what's he saying? Some of the things that happen are due to providence by approval, whereas others are by permission. The rain falling from the sky is by approval. Okay? Earthquakes even are by approval. Okay? Permission? What's permission? That's allowing people to do things. Seeing before this point, let's say this is creation. Seeing and knowing before Adam reaching for the fruit, and yet going ahead and creating. What is that? That's permission. Okay, go ahead. I know what's going to happen. I'm going to take care of it, and allowing it to go right ahead and to occur. Thus, he often permits even the just man to meet with misfortunes, so that the virtue hidden in him may be made known, not to him, to others. You know, when the disciples or people come up to Christ and say, you know, why was this man born paralyzed? Was it because of his sins or his parents? And, you know, Jesus is like, give it a break, guys. It's not always because of sin. It's so that you might see the glory of God made manifest. Get up. Go sin no more. And the guy's like, woohoo, you know, yippee. Okay. Now, what could he have said? I'm lying here 38 years.
Yeah, where were you?
For the glory of God, you know. No, he doesn't have any of that. So, he permits something iniquitous, that's sinful, to be done so that through this apparently iniquitous action, notice, apparently iniquitous action, an excellent thing may be brought about, like the salvation through the cross. Well, what's the iniquitous thing there? Judas, Christ. Still another way, he permits the devout man to suffer evil so that he may not depart from his right conscience, or so that he may not fall into presumption the strength and grace that have been given him. In other words, because you could be going along in life and everything could be going great for you, and you could start thinking, oh, do this. Wham! You get your legs taken out from under you. All right? Talks about Lazarus, you know. Person 62 may even be allowed at times to fall into an immoral action for the correction of another and worse affliction. For example. And I kind of imagine when he says, for example, he's saying, you know, I've heard about things like this. Certain person is conceited about his virtues and righteousness. Oh, I'm so holy. I follow the law. I do everything perfectly. And what happened? God permits him to fall into fornication. Becomes an adulterer. And fornication, keep in mind, isn't necessarily only sexual fornication. It can be following false gods, so to speak. Like the fornication of Sony or Xbox or your car or whatever thing becomes your idol. So that by his fall he may become conscious of his own weakness, be humbled, and drawn confess to God. Now, in this particular instance, I think he is talking sexual fornication. Somebody who thinks he's high and mighty and pure and virtuous. He sees Bathsheba over on the top of the roof, and he goes and sleeps with her, and he realizes his sin. It's like, so much for thinking I'm so and mighty and pure. All right? So then he goes on and talks about the two kinds of abandonment that God then shows. One is for, he says, our instruction, and the other is ultimate rejection. In other words, God sometimes abandons people so that they will turn from their wicked ways. Or he abandons people so that they'll try to rely on him even more. Other times he abandons people because they're being consigned to hell. Okay? I think the first kind, if you're not talking about sin, would be like that 50-year drought that Teresa experienced. I think I've told that story in class. Okay? So the ways of God's providence are many. Yeah, it's warm in here. You could go over there and turn the thing down. Of course, the jet engines will fire up. The ways of God's providence are many. They can neither be explained in words nor grasped by the mind. And yet, what's he been doing for the last,
Well,
One must note that those who accept him with thanksgiving, the attacks of adversity redound to salvation and become instruments of aid. Which is why monks and quote-unquote saints talk about everything bad that happens to them as being deserved and being necessary. And they'll give advice to their followers. If someone criticizes you, even if you've not done anything, even if you don't know the person, one word to them, take the criticism and apply it. Say, oh, yeah, you're right. I'm a rotten SOB. This is what I need to hear. Okay? And then he talks about how God antecedently and almost properly, after, wills all to be saved. Okay? He talks about the first, God's antecedent will and approval, which has God as its cause, and the second, the consequent will and permission, and has ourselves as its cause. Well, what's he talking about? He's talking about God's knowledge and predestination, which he's going to get into in the next passage. Go to that next passage. Where he says, one should note that God, chapter 30, one should know that God foreknows all things, but that he does not predestine them all. Okay? Because, in the mind of God, he saw everything that was to be. He knew everything that would occur. He knows all things that depend upon us. That is, he knows everything that will happen as a result of our actions. I said to somebody, the cold shoulder I gave to somebody, the parking spot I took from somebody, whatever. All right? But he doesn't predestine them. See, this is where some Calvinists, I won't say all, this is where some Calvinists get it all wrong. To say, it's predestined. Period.
I've met these people.
I went to school with these people, believe me.
You ever gotten into an internet debate?
Don't do it.
Yeah, especially on YouTube. It's a terrible, terrible idea. Because small amount of space. Anyway.
Well, life's too short for that simple reason.
But yeah, I noticed that hardline Calvinists, in that vein, only believe that, but unlike, for instance, I don't know, other areas of Christianity, they have a particular, they seem to have a particular adamist, they seem to be particularly adamant about the necessity of doctrine.
Yeah. Because they're among the elect.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's so much that as that it's if you're predestined, then you're not. Well, I guess it's kind of like what we talked about earlier. Then it's not. There's no. Oh, but then I decided because I have the will to it. I think it's some of that more than just like.
It removes the virtue because to a strict Calvinist, there is no virtue.
Right.
You cannot choose at all. It has to be entirely God. That's why, you have, you guys have probably heard of this before, some of you maybe. The 5 points of Calvinism. It's a simple oversimplification, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement. So when it says Christ came for all, not really. He only came for the irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. So if you are unconditionally elected, you will experience irresistible grace. You cannot turn it down. And because of that, you will persevere to the end. Somebody who's a good Christian, take Billy Graham, and who's on his deathbed, and if on his deathbed, he goes, "Damn you, God," and dies. That would show he didn't have perseverance. He didn't persevere to the end. Therefore, he was always in Satan's camp.
Unconditional elect in the first place.
He was never a Christian.
Yeah.
Tell that to the millions of people who became Christians as a result of Billy Graham States kind of thing. I mean, and what this means, total depravity, means there is not a shred of goodness. There is not a single aspect of the human nature / psyche that is not dark, okay? That is not blackened by sin.
Which is funny when you take it right down to like I said, the truly hardline Calvinists who believe in total. Then not only is there no virtue in the choice to repent from your sin, it's kind of difficult to see how there's any guilt in the sin in the first place, because not only is your repentance immediately attributable to God, but everything to that.
No, that's where you have free will.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that's some Calvinists, but I've talked to some who were like, God decrees every sin that you made, every sin that you committed was decreed by God, and
I know.
And it's a bizarre idea when it really gets down to it. It's something that obviously takes hundreds of years after.
Well,
Christ
you don't see that idea in the early fathers, with one exception. With one exception, you do see it in St. Augustine.
Yeah.
That emphasis on predestination in St. Augustine. And St. Augustine of the early fathers is preeminently the one that influenced Christianity. I mean, the medieval church is built upon St. Augustine's teachings. Original sin, which is in with Calvinism, is tied into the whole notion of all of this. I mean, it's central. But the vast majority of the fathers, especially those from the Middle East, they don't even use the term original sin. It's ancestral sin. Because what's meant by ancestral is the first sin, or the sin of the first parents. Because all they mean by that, all the fathers mean by that, what happens as a result of that sin is the effects of it get passed down. The effects: sin, death, okay, pain, not guilt.
Right.
For St. Augustine, it's guilt. Guilt gets passed through sex.
That's why in the Western Church, there's such a, as I was reading here, there's not as much emphasis in the Eastern Church times on infant baptism. That comes in much later in the Eastern Church, whereas in the Western Church, post-Augustine, there's this idea that you have to baptize the kids real quick, because otherwise...
Yeah, it's not really even post-Augustine. It's quite a bit later than that. The Eastern Church actually does, even early, by 200, they're doing infant baptisms. But not because, just a second, Jason, not because they're concerned babies are going to hell.
Right.
That idea does come from Augustine. That a child that isn't baptized goes to hell.
because they're guilty.
because they're guilty of original sin.
Suggesting that you're suggesting that an act that you do is changing, is making the child, which is not at all.
If you think about it, though, as far as Calvinist theology goes, no act for the human to do it isn't the one ultimately. Like, when you become one of the elect, it isn't your choice anyway. So why not have it done?
Yeah, but why would it matter?
Well, in Calvinism, largely in the Protestant Church,
Yeah.
sacrament. Keep that in mind. It's not an act of sanctifying grace.
Right.
It's what's called an
act of
ordinance.
obedience. Yeah.
It's an act of obedience.
Right.
And that's it. It's merely being obedient. There's nothing ontologically occurs at that moment. In the church, no. Something ontologically happens. At the act of baptism, that person is literally cleansed of sin. So whether that person is an 8-day-old baby or an 80-year-old man, if it's an 80-year-old man or an 8-year-old boy or an 8-year-old man, when they come up out of that water, if it's an immersion baptism or if it's sprinkling, whatever, when that act of baptism is done, okay, they are literally washed clean from sin at that moment. Now, it doesn't mean when they walk out that door that they're still going to be clean from sin. I mean, they come up out of that water, they're clean, and they look at some sexy young blonde wearing a low-cut dress in the church, and they're going, hello, that might, that's strike one, strike two, they're walking out because now they're thinking, strike, okay? But the act itself is an act of grace, where grace becomes imparted to that individual, all right? So he goes on and talks about the consequent will and permission, and he says, the things which depend upon us, the good ones, God antecedently and approves. Well, what does he mean by that?
Simply that it's not just permission, it's approval.
Exactly. But what are the good ones? The feeding, taking care of other people, essentially being nice to people. Quote unquote good works. Okay? Evil ones, essentially being a selfish SOB, thinking of yourself rather than anybody else. Okay? He neither wills antecedently nor consequently, but permits them. Notice that. Because he permits them, what could God do? He could stop them. But if God's going to be constantly stopping people from exercising their free will, what's the point? Exactly. It's not free will. Okay? So, he foreknows things that depend upon us, but he does not predestine them. Neither does he will evil to be done, nor does he force virtue. Predestination is the result of the divine command made with foreknowledge. What was the divine command? Let there be light. That is, before he even spoke, knew exactly what was going to happen. For through his foreknowledge, he's already decided all things beforehand, in accordance with his goodness and justice. And you see a nice image of this in Tolkien's Silmarillion, if you've ever read it. Because in the Silmarillion, it begins with the creation of the world. Creation of the world, you have God who creates these angelic beings called the Ainur. And the Ainur he gives music to, and so they start to sing. Each one sings according to its own particular character and nature. And so they're all singing, they're all making this music, and it's this great harmonic symphony. And then finally one of them, the highest of the Ainur, says, I'm tired of this music, I want to make my own noise. And that's what he does, he makes it. So where there's been wonderful singing or harmony, all of a sudden you get, fingers down the chalkboard kind of a thing. And Eru hears that, he introduces a new theme. And the new theme in the music takes that noise and weaves it in. Okay? And then Melkor, the one weaving the bad notes in, notices that, and he tries to get even louder. He doesn't change his music. He just tries to get louder. It's an interesting little detail. And so he gets louder, and so Eru then weaves another theme. And each time he does this, one time he raises one hand, and then he raises. The third time he stands up, and there's silence, And he says, now, Melkor, now that you can know that nothing happens that does not have its uttermost in me. Let me show you. And he plays the reel of the creation of the world to the end of the world for them. And he shows, in the story Tolkien does, he shows how no matter what happens, God Eru, takes everything bad that Melkor tried to turn in and turns it into a good. Turns everything horrible. And I mean horrible. Every rape, every murder, every incest, every horrible, rotten thing, and brings out of it. Just like, go to a compost pile that has all refuse and everything thrown in, and leave it there and turn it and water it, and what happens? It becomes nourishing. It becomes life-producing. It becomes life-affirming. Okay? That's essentially what he's talking about here. Okay? And that's just about
That's about it.
About it, yeah. So we'll pick up with book 3 on Tuesday.
What time is it?